it's Mo. It is May 15th, and I have just sat down to talk about the books that I've read so far in May. So this is definitely time for another vlog style monthly reading wrap up. These are videos that I do every month where I try to talk about each book that I've read throughout the month as close to when I've finished them as possible. A lot of times it's not really that close, and I try to talk for about 5 minutes about each book, tell you something about the book, tell you what I thought of it, my thoughts on it. A lot of these books are also in other reading blogs, so if they are, I will mention that here, or if they're part of readathons, I will also talk about that in these videos. The first book that I finished in May was Poems by Hermann Hesse. This was selected and translated by James Wright. Hermann Hesse is a well-known German author, and I've only read one of his books, Siddhartha, but I love that book so much. I've been collecting a lot of other Hermann Hesse books, but I did not know that Hermann Hesse also wrote poetry. So I was super happy to find this at a book sale or somewhere. I think it was actually at the Salvation Army. I enjoyed these poems. I liked that they had the German on one side and the English translation on the other. I thought that was pretty cool. I am always interested, I don't speak German, but I'm always interested in how poems are translated, so it's kind of interesting to see them written out in both languages. There were some poems in here that I enjoyed, some nature poems, and there's a whole section of poems that take place during World War I. Hesse's feelings on the war, and specifically like about missing people and wondering what's going to happen to people during the war. Some of those I found really interesting. Overall, I did have quite a bit, but not as much as like some poetry collections that I'm really into. I would highly recommend it if you're a fan of Hesse's work, or if you're a fan of poetry, or if you're a fan of translated poetry. Obviously, this is a good one to read. Hopefully I will find more of Hesse's poetry to read as well. The next book I finished in May was The Incredible World Champ Mets by Maury Allen. This is a nonfiction book written right after the Mets won the World Series in 1969. It is falling apart. My copy is completely destroyed. This is an old copy that either my husband had or I got at a used book sale. I read it because each year I read books about baseball around opening day. This year my opening day vlog has not come out yet so far as of filming this video. I did do a whole vlog on this book, and the other book that I read for that vlog was a sports cozy mystery, a baseball cozy mystery. You can see my thoughts on the baseball cozy mystery in my April wrap up, and now we're going to hear more of my thoughts on this. So I love a nonfiction book. This one is interesting because it's set in a very specific time and it's about a very specific topic. It was created so close to the time that this topic happened. So I think something that was really notable about this book was the language used and the sentiment of baseball and the sentiment of baseball language and how baseball is talked about, and it very much came across. But it also felt very dated because of that, because it was written so close to the World Series and to the Mets' inception, because the Mets were a expansion team and they weren't created until 1963. This definitely feels like it has a lot of dated ideas about baseball and a lot of dated ideas about how you talk about baseball. There's this overarching, like, tongue-in-cheek, silly quotes kind of vibe to this book, and this kind of like old-timey baseball talk in this book that I don't think they really do anymore. I mean, a little bit, maybe announcers do it, and certain announcers, but not quite so much. It was a little bit hard to read, a little bit repetitive, a little bit taxing because of that. So this did take me like over a month to read. I also think that the whole beginning part of this book is really interesting because it's about the inception of the team, and it's about creating the team mentality and getting all the players, finding the right managers, finding the right coaches. That is the beginning, the seeds, the start of the Mets, which is super fascinating. But the end, like quarter, is basically just about the end of their season that year, the year that they won the World Series, and how they felt about that and how each game in their season, at the end of their season, mattered to lead them to the playoffs and then eventually to the World Series. So it did definitely get very repetitive. We heard about every inning of every game, and it's just a little bit dry. If you were maybe a baseball fan, a greater baseball fan than I am, you could imagine all those plays and you could get excited about them. But to me, it was just a little bit more repetitive, and I would have liked to have heard more about the aftermath and maybe a little bit more about what happened to the team after they won the World Series, you know, how that occurred. There are those plays and play-by-plays and inning-by-inning aspects throughout this whole book, but not so intense as the last part. Overall, I thought there was some really interesting things in here. There's a quote in here about the Mets specifically that I love and really encapsulates my idea of the Mets, but you'll have to check out that vlog to see me read that quote because I don't know where it is in the book. I did tab quite a few things, not quite a few, but I tabbed a few things in this book. There were a couple of ideas and aspects of this book that I really appreciated, and again, I loved reading the history and learning about the history, so it was totally a fun read. The next book that I read in May, I read on audio, and that was A Lady for a Duke by Alexis Hall. So this is a Regency romance featuring a trans main character. It's all about Viola, who in the early part of her life had a best friend and lived a certain life, and then they went to war together, to the Napoleonic War, I think, when Viola goes missing in action and everyone thinks that they're dead. She takes the opportunity to become the woman that she's always actually been. So she's super lucky in the fact that she meets a few people who help her out on her journey, and then she's also very lucky that her brother and sister-in-law accept her back into the family as Viola and take her on as a new member of staff slash family, as Viola's sister-in-law's lady-in-waiting, lady companion. Viola's been herself for a few years now, been living with the family, but she hasn't really ventured out that much. One of the things that she dreads is meeting people from her past life, especially her best friend, who happens to be a duke. When Viola's sister-in-law finds out that the duke's sister needs a coming out party, Viola goes as her companion to see the duke, and we find out that Viola's best friend is having a really hard time of it. He's addicted to laudanum, he had a really rough go in the war, and mostly he's been grieving the death of his best friend for these last 2 or 3 years. So Viola and the Duke start getting close again and start forming a relationship in their new lives, and then the story goes from there. So this is interesting because I've never read a Regency romance. I don't even know when the Regency time is. That's why I was like confused about what war is going on. So that part was weird, and it was kind of out of time for me because I couldn't solidly put it in a time period from my own knowledge, and I don't think this story, although it had references to the time period, was super rooted in time. It definitely had a lot to do with the clothing and ladies' clothing of the time, and it definitely had a lot to do with the responsibility of the Duke and how he tends for his tenants and his land. And then of course it did have a lot to do about the war because both Viola and the Duke have a lot of trauma and PTSD from the war, especially the Duke, who's suffering severe PTSD that's exacerbated, not really helped by his laudanum addiction. I mean, I guess that part was good. I didn't mind it. I thought it was fine. I thought it was interesting, but I have nothing to base it on, so I'm sure people who read more Regency romances will have more to say about that particular setting. But I really liked this story. I thought it was a really cute, sweet romance. I did think that the time, not the time period, but like the time that we see Viola and the Duke together was a little bit strange. Like the progression of their new relationship was hard to tell how long each thing was. It was hard to tell how long they were initially visiting the Duke and his sister. It was hard to tell how long the time period was after. So it felt a little disjointed to me in that way. Not necessarily that the romance came on too quickly, but that I didn't really understand where we were in time a lot of a lot of the story, so that did take me out of the story a little bit. But overall, I liked it. I thought Viola had a strong character, and I really liked the way that her transition was handled and how people appreciated her or not in some cases, but how that was dealt with. There is definitely a little bit of dead naming in this, or some instances where Viola's former friends don't know what to call her or how to refer to her. So there's a tiny bit of that, but for the most part, I would say that this is like a super accepting, super casually queer, super wonderful and open and accepting relationship that she has with almost everyone. There's a lot of other queer characters in this as well, and it was nice to see this kind of community of people at a time when maybe that wasn't accepted. Not that it's accepted now per se, but like a time that you think of as being extremely straight, although, you know, all times are gay. But anyway, it was nice to see like people being open-minded and people being accepting and whatever. I do think though that that was one of my problems with the book. My problem's not a problem with the book itself, but my problem where it is hard for me to accept that kindness, that openness, that open-mindedness, and the idea that there wouldn't be huge problems revolving around your queerness, revolving around people realizing that you were transgender. To me, it was unbelievable in some ways, which like, it shouldn't have to be believable. It's a fantasy, it's a fiction, it is a utopian kind of take on, or a idyllic take on the experience that this person had. So I should have gone into it with a more like open, accepting mind as well. So, but it was a little bit hard for me to get past. It wasn't super steamy, but there were a couple of steamy aspects, and I do think that some of the steamy aspects took me by surprise, just the way that they were handled, but I really liked that. I'd say the spice level was on the lower side, and that wasn't the part that was interesting, but more the sexual dynamic of the characters I found to be really interesting and intriguing, and not what I had expected initially. So I really enjoyed this one. I would definitely read more by Alexis Hall. I don't know if I really want to read their most popular stories like Boyfriend Material and some of the other popular contemporary stories. I would love to read more trans love stories from Alexis Hall. I would love to read just more trans historical fiction love stories. I think would be fun to see how other people handle it. And then of course just trans love stories in general. The next book that I finished in May was The Woman in the Library by Sulari Gentile. This is a mystery, kind of a cozy mystery, and a book within a book, and kind of a story within a story, which is interesting. So there is, in the beginning of this, a opening chapter that is a letter. This is partly an epistolary story. We are hearing from someone, a man named Leo. He is writing to a writer friend of his who lives in Australia. It's kind of the middle of the pandemic, and he's writing to her so happy that he has received preview chapters of her new novel, and so excited that they're friends, like via online / via like letter writing, and that he is able to read this new story. And then chapter 1 is the story that Hannah's writing. So the bigger chapters in between the epistolary chapters are about a group of people who are in a Boston public library. 4 people meet kind of accidentally, but immediately they're drawn to each other, and as they're sitting chatting, they hear a woman scream in the library, and later discover that that woman was murdered in the library. These 4 people are our like main characters, and we get to know them, we get to know why they feel connected and what they were all doing in the library and who they are. And our main character is a writer in the group, and she is now writing a story about these 4 characters and about this incident in the library. So that is kind of the book within the book. And when we get more letters from Leo, we're finding out more about his thoughts on this, about Hannah as a writer, and about how Hannah is writing this story. Leo is from Boston, so he's helping her write this story. He's letting her know some discrepancies, and then later he's starting to let her know when he's displeased with how the story's going. The letters from Leo get more and more strange as the book goes on, and then we see certain parallels with the case and the relationships with the people in the story of The Woman in the Library. So it's very much an interesting meta cozy mystery with some like thrilling aspects, not like a thrilling aspects, but definitely some suspenseful aspects is a better way to put it. And it's fun to get the story that we're reading about these four people broken up with this other story of the actual author of the story. I am super happy to have read this one. I read it on audio and I thought the reader did a really good job. This was on my 24 books I wanted to read in 2024 that I got in 2023 list. So this was a book that I wanted to read. I picked up in 2023 and I put on that list because I didn't get to it all of 2023 and now I have. Super happy to have done that. I liked pretty much everything about it, but I will say I have no idea what the ending meant. There is an ending to this book on the very last page that, I don't know, maybe meant something, maybe had some significance, but it was totally lost on me. Like, I'm not sure what it meant, what happened, what implication to all the different stories it had, because it was connected to all the stories. So if you've read The Woman in the Library, definitely let me know if you got the ending and what it meant. If you haven't read it, you might not like the ending. I know a lot of people don't like the ending. I didn't mind the ending. It didn't ruin the story for me, but it did just leave me confused. So if you're not big on an ambiguous ending, or if you're not big on an ending that is not super clear, this might not be the one for you. If you like a book within a book, and if you like the idea of that meta universe looking glass, I would definitely check this one out. The next book that I read in May was Hereafter by Amy Lynn. I won this book in a Goodreads giveaway, and it's this adorable little hardcover. I had never heard of it before. It just sounded really interesting, and so I entered the giveaway and then I won, and I'm so glad I did because I think that this is going to make it to my top books of 2024. I loved this memoir. It is a nonfiction about Amy, all about her personality and her life, but specifically revolving around the sudden and inexplicable death of her husband. So we meet Amy and we meet her husband, and we see Amy just as her husband dies, and we go on kind of her journey of acceptance and understanding and depression and sorrow and grief, and it's all told in these extremely short little vignette chapters. It jumps back and forth in time. Sometimes we're talking about when Amy met her husband, sometimes we're talking about the aftermath of her husband's death, sometimes we're talking about a little bit into the future, sometimes we're talking a little bit into the past, and it's just a really moving, compulsive read. I read this one physically, but I heard the audiobook is really amazing too. But I read, 40 pages of this book, and then I read the whole next bit in one day. It was so captivating, it was so compulsive, it was so sad, it was so tragic, but it just made you want to go on and read it. I really liked Amy's very simple prose, but very honest and open and raw writing about her own experience and about her own grief and about her own flaws. I mean, there were parts of this that I think were or could have been, or you might assume are, hyperbole on her part about her relationship with her husband, but even that aspect, whether it was genuinely the truth, what is the truth, or the truth that Amy feels, was compelling to read, because through the lens of grief, how do we view people? How do we view our time with people? How do we view the past? When you're grieving and when you've suffered a loss, are you romanticizing the past, or are you dreading it? Are you making it more awful than it was? And so it was really just a very raw and real reaction, and you could imagine having that reaction, or you could imagine having different reactions to Amy's story if you were in her shoes. So it was really great. I really loved it. I would definitely highly recommend this one. It takes like no time to read, super compelling, super compulsive. Definitely if you're interested in memoirs and if you can handle very tragic death and grief, family illness, and all other trigger warnings that you might find for this book, I would definitely pick it up. The next book that I read in May was Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino. This was my April pick for the TBR spin. The prompt was to read a book that a friend has been begging you to read. A friend was not begging me to read this, but it is my friend Isaac's copy. So I did want to read it. I've had it for over a year, so I wanted to read it. it and get it back to him. Italo Calvino is a modern Cuban-Italian author who writes Italian modern classics. So I've read one other book by Italo Calvino, and that was The Baron in the Trees. Both The Baron in the Trees and Invisible Cities are told in short story form or vignettes, very, very short chapters with a framing narrative that helps make them a cohesive whole. So in Baron in the Trees, we find out about a young baron who decides he's never going to set foot on the earth again and about all his adventures. In Invisible Cities, we see Kublai Khan and Marco Polo meeting up, and Kublai Khan, who is ruling over his vast empire, is asking Marco Polo to tell him all about the different cities within this empire or the different cities that Marco Polo has visited. And then Marco Polo is answering Kublai Khan, and he tells a little story about each city. So we have cities in desire, cities in memory, cities in signs, thin cities, trading cities, and then we have repeats of those things as well. So there might be cities and signs 1, cities and signs 2. After a few stories about the cities, we go back to Kublai Khan and Marco Polo, and we see them discussing the cities and the idea of these cities and how amazing and fantastical they are. And each city probably could be some sort of allegory or fable that you could glean a deeper meaning from. A lot of the cities are like about death and the idea of dying, the idea of transition and transitoriness, the idea that whoever's coming to the city sees the city in a different way, so every single person's experience of a city is going to create a different city. Very interesting stuff, very cool. Definitely right up my alley, and I really, really enjoyed this one. It took me a little bit to read, only because I kept pausing because I am doing a vlog of this, so if I couldn't update the vlog, I would like wait, and then I would get a little bit out of it. I think you could definitely read this in a day or two, and I would definitely highly suggest reading this one as you're traveling and as you're feeling that idea of being a newcomer in a city, or you're in a new place, or you're in a new environment. I think that this is a very like dreamy, fairy tale like experience that would only be heightened by reading it while you're traveling. Let me know if you've read any Italo Calvino. I'm super excited. I have If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler, and I have a collection of short stories by him as well. I really enjoy his work. Super happy to have read Invisible Cities. Those were all the books that I've read so far in May, and when I read some more, I will let you know. Okay, it is May 26th, and I've read quite a few more books in May. The next book that I read was Comfort Me with Apples by Catherine M. Valente. I read this because it is a horror book and it is horror mayhem, but I also read it for a vlog that I'm doing about some book lists that I started in 2020, and I've been working my way through. So you will see more of my thoughts in that vlog. Comfort Me with Apples is a very short horror novella. We are introduced to a woman, and the first thought that she has when she wakes up in the morning is, he was made for me. And she goes throughout her day thinking about her perfect husband and her perfect house and her perfect life and the perfect gated community that they live in, and how perfect everything is, and how this life was made for her and she was made for it. So that's the basic premise of the book, and that's really all you need to know going into it, and that's basically all I knew going into it. I think people have been really, really good about not spoiling this one, and I'm so glad, because I do think even that description each person gets a certain idea of what the book might be. I was pleasantly surprised that it wasn't what I thought, which is great, which is what I love, you know, especially in a horror, especially in a novella, especially in a book that I don't know that much about. Like, I love to be surprised, I love to be intrigued, I love to be captivated, and Comfort Me with Apples really did do that. This is the first Catherine M. Valente that I've read, but I'm interested in basically everything she's written. I do own one of her books, which is called Space Opera, which I've had for quite a while. So I did put that on my summer TBR recently again, so that I could really try to get to it. And now that I've read one Catherine M. Valente, I definitely am super stoked to read more. This was not a gory horror. This was not a violent horror, but this was more of a creeping dread horror, more of a finding clues or unexpected things that you don't know the meaning of and that you have to kind of grapple with all the potentials of kind of horror, more of a psychological horror, which I really, really enjoy. That's probably more of my favorite kind of horror than like gory horror, but there's definitely a lot of action in this and some very tense moments, some very thrilling moments that happen. So if you're interested in anything like this, it's super short. It's like a 3-hour audiobook, so I would definitely pick it up. I got it on my library app. I would love to hear more people talking about this. It did come out quite a few years ago and people were really hyped on it when it first came out. I know Catherine M. Valente has written other things since then, but I've never heard anyone talk about any of her work as much as they talked about Comfort Me with Apples. The next book that I finished in May was Buddha in the Attic by Julie Otsuka, and this I thought was the first in her 3 books because all her 3 books are like tangentially connected somehow, but it is not the first, it's the second. So I read the middle book first, but it doesn't really matter because they are actually all standalones and only, like I said, are precariously connected. As far as I know, obviously I've only read this book, so that could be totally wrong. Buddha in the Attic is told all in a choral voice, so it's told from like the we perspective, it's told from many hundreds of women's voices, and it talks about women and girls who have come over from Japan to America in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and how they are feeling, what they felt on the boat over, if they were excited to get married to Japanese men in America, what they thought America would be like, what they thought their new husbands would be like, what they thought life would be like, what they thought work would be like, and then the realities of what all those things actually were as they found out that they weren't coming over to be glamorous Americans and necessarily live a better life, about how many of them became migrant workers or servants in white people's houses, about the racism they faced, and then as time goes on about what their thoughts on their husband were, what their thoughts on their children were, kind of towards the end of this book, how World War II and the mass deportations and mass incarcerations in concentration camps in America was, what the experience of that was for Japanese people dealing with the repercussions of World War II and the conflict between America and Japan. So it was a really interesting book. I read this book on audio and I did really enjoy the audio book. I do think reading it physically might have given you more of a connection because it's told in a choral voice. There's not one person or one story to follow. There's not one person to be connected with. You feel a connection to these women, certainly, but you are constantly switching between people and you're dealing with a huge group of women and the shared commonalities of their lives and the differences of their lives. It was a heartfelt book. It was a tragic book. It was an uplifting book. It was a depressing book, but it wasn't a book that you felt connected to someone or that you could immerse yourself in the story, kind of. You felt empathy towards all these women and their situations, good and bad, and mostly bad. You know, this definitely is a more depressing book and definitely has a heavy tone to it and a heavy feel to it. But I think maybe reading it physically, you would have felt closer just because of the physical sensation, reading it with your eyeballs. And since it's told in that choral voice, it's also told in like all vignettes. So I think it would have been really quick and compelling. Whereas reading this on audio, even though it's only like a 5-hour audiobook, it took me a lot longer to get through. I think you would have like, if you read this physically, you would have like kind of flown through it. Although it is very heavy and depressing, so maybe you wouldn't have. I did really like it. It didn't teach me anything new necessarily, but I do think it gives a good insight into the Japanese experience, Japanese women's experience specifically, coming over at a time when people didn't know anything about Japan, didn't know anything about the culture, didn't know anything about the people, and then seeing them learn about it, and then seeing that tenuous appreciation turn
during World War II. And obviously the idea of like concentration camps and everything else. And then at the very end of this book, there is a little portion that's not told from the Japanese women, still told in a choral voice and a multiple perspective, but told from like white people's perspective. So that was interesting too. I mean, I enjoyed the entire book, but as a book, I think it is quite different and quite experimental. So I don't know if everyone would like it. I think if you're unfamiliar with the immigration of Japanese women at that time and you just want to know more about it, this is a good fictional book to look at. And I did really enjoy it, but I didn't enjoy it as much as many people love it, and I didn't enjoy it as much as I expected to enjoy it. Like, I thought I was gonna love this book, and I didn't. And it's interesting because I think like I've been putting it off partly because of that, and I have all of her other books too. Like, it feels easier now to read those other books because I'm not placing a like high expectation on them anymore. I really did like this, and I do suggest Buddha in the Attic if this is something that you're interested in reading. I talked about this one out of order because actually the next book that I finished in May was The Suffering by Rin Chupeco. This is the sequel to The Girl from the Well, and this I also read on audio. I read The Girl from the Well last year or the year before, and it is a YA horror book, the first in a duology. The Girl from the Well follows the girl from the well, primarily, who we find out is a angry spirit who has been killing murderers. So she has been working her way around various places since her death in like the 13th century, killing killers. One day she's in America and she sees a boy who's kind of slated to be killed by a serial killer, and she becomes enamored with this boy, and once she saves him and kills his potential murderer who has murdered other people, she becomes attached to him and they go on a further adventure. So that is kind of like the beginning of the first book, and then you find out their further adventure. And in The Suffering, we see Tarkin and this spirit, the girl from the well, again. They're still connected. They're still helping each other with these supernatural and paranormal elements, and they're still fighting for justice for murdered children. So they go on a further adventure, which involves some of the people that we met in the first book. This is the conclusion to their story in many ways. So we see more about their relationship, the girl from the well and Tarkin, and we see more about just their lives and how their lives have changed since the events of the girl from the well, and then also like where their lives are going and whether they're going to continue to be connected or whether something is going to change. So I really like the girl from the well. It's definitely horror. I don't know, it's like a combination of young YA and older YA because the language and the violence is intense, like gross, disgusting, bloody, violent violence. And then the language, there's a lot of cursing and there's a lot of adult language. And obviously there's a lot of adult themes because a lot of the people that they're bringing to justice were rapists, murderers, child abusers, you know, did really horrible, gross things. The way the girl in the well died was really disturbing and tragic. So like, it's very adult in that way, but then all the other parts are written in like a lower YA kind of way, like a very simple, very accessible young YA kind of way. So I still would say that this is upper YA and definitely not for the faint of heart, but on the other hand, could be read by younger readers. I wouldn't suggest it though. I do think that this is one that you might want to like talk to your teens about because there is a lot about sexual abuse. There is a lot about murder. It is very dark. There's also the idea of loss of family. Tarkin's mother died, and there is a lot of grief around that, and there's a lot of discussion of that. His father is quite distant and they don't have the best relationship, so there's, you know, a lot of talk of that, and he's a very isolated, depressed character, so that is something that you could discuss with your teens as well. Overall though, I really did enjoy the series. I thought it was like fun. It's not fast paced because each book kind of has two parts. Each book kind of starts with smaller stories, and then those stories kind of give you an introduction to who the people are and what's going on, and then lead into a longer story that takes up like the second 2/3 of the book or second half of the book. So it's not fast paced, but it is pretty compelling, and I do think there's a lot of interesting Japanese myths and ideas and cultural ideas woven in. And then in both books we do travel to Japan, so there's also some description of Japanese landscapes and things like that, which are really interesting and I enjoyed. You could read The Suffering as a standalone. I definitely wouldn't suggest it, and I do think that The Girl from the Well was the stronger of the two of the series. But if you're looking for like an easy to read, not fast, but easy to read YA horror, or if you love YA horror, I would definitely pick this series up. The next book that I read in May was Rental Person Who Does Nothing by Shoji Morimoto. This is a memoir of a young man who in 2018 changed his career and decided to become a rental person who does nothing. So he started a Twitter account saying that he could be rented out for the price of his travel fare, and for anything that might happen, the rentee, the client, would have to pay for. But he wasn't going to do anything. He wasn't going to give you advice. He wasn't going to carry things for you. He wasn't going to help you move, anything like that. But he could be with you at a time that you might need a person with you, but not want to bring a family member or a friend. So it kind of turned into this service where people would rent Rental Person to come with them to a restaurant they'd never been to, but they didn't want to go alone. He might come with them and wait outside while they did a task. He might come with them and sit in the park and save a spot for them for like a concert for later, or he might accompany them to their house to watch them study. And by watch them study, he really didn't do anything. Sometimes he would read, sometimes he would be on his phone, sometimes he would be literally doing nothing and staring out into space. But the idea was that this person worked better when someone else was in the room, or when they felt like they had someone there to spur them on. He also got requests for just congratulating someone, or for telling someone they had a pretty girlfriend, or whatever. He was willing to do very simple communication if he could answer something very simply. If it was something that he already knew about or something that he felt comfortable discussing, he would talk to the person, and still does. This is still going on today. I don't mean to talk about it in the past tense. If someone rented him as Rental Person to congratulate them, he would say exactly verbatim like what they asked him to say. If someone asked him to accompany them, he would speak to them, but he wouldn't provide any insights or communication other than simple responses. So it's really interesting. And even writing this book, Rental Person Who Does Nothing, Morimoto didn't want to do anything. So what he did was he had an editor ask him very simple questions about his work, and then he answered them. And then that's it. So he didn't actually physically write it. There's even an afterword in the back that talks kind of more about what he felt was doing something and what wasn't. So it's really interesting. It's very short. It's a proof. This book came out on January 9th, 2024. I found this arc in a little free library in Belmar, New Jersey, and I'd been wanting to read it. I think it's only like 200 pages, and a lot of it is the tweets that he sent out. There's some photographs of him. There's a lot of short kind of vignette ideas of the different services that he provided, or the answers that he provided to the questions that the editor asked him. It was an interesting idea of, one, like not taking money, this not being like a job. He isn't paid by the client. He's only given reimbursements for the money that he spends, or he's given a meal, or he's given drinks at a bar, or a lemonade, or whatever it is. And he doesn't ask for any exchange of goods for what he's doing other than just those reimbursements. But people do give him money, do give him gifts and things like that. And then also he has a Twitter, so he's probably making some kind of like AdSense style money as well. So that part was really interesting. It was really interesting for the idea that this person wanted to be a blank slate, thought of himself as a blank slate, was a blank slate, and thought that that was something he could provide. It was interesting what people people requested of him and what he turned down, because he's very specific about turning things down if he doesn't want to do them. So I thought this was fascinating. I read it in like a day. It's super short. And I think there's actually a movie or a TV show online coming out about this, and I don't know if it's a documentary or a fictional account based on his experiences, but I would be interested in looking at that too. Those are all the books that I've read so far in May. I have about a week to go, so I might read some more, and when I read some more, I'll come back. It is June, and I have read a few more books in May to round out the month. The next book that I read in May was The Death of Jane Lawrence by Caitlin Starling. I've read one other Caitlin Starling, Yellow Jessamine, and I really liked that one. Yellow Jessamine was a queer gothic novella, so I was hoping that Jane Lawrence would have queer themes as well. I picked this one up at a library sale last year because I liked Yellow Jessamine, and this cover is also amazing. The Death of Jane Lawrence is about Jane, who is a young mathematician, accountant, whose family died when she was little, and she was adopted by like family friends. Now she's of age to marry, and her adopted family is moving, so she wants to get married as like a business arrangement. She's really not interested in romance. She's really not interested in relationship, but she wants to get married as a business relationship so that she can stay where she is, so she's not a burden to her adopted family, and so that she can like live the life that she wants to lead. She picks Dr. Lawrence as the person that she's going to marry, like out of statistical reasoning and detached idealism of like who would be the best husband. So she meets Dr. Lawrence, and surprise, surprise, they have an attraction. They end up entering into a business relationship marriage, but Jane develops feelings for Dr. Lawrence. One of the stipulations of marrying Dr. Lawrence for Jane is that they don't have to have emotional attachment, and that she gets to work on her sums and figures and accounting the way that she wants to. One of the stipulations for marriage on Dr. Lawrence's part is that she help him in his hospital medical facility, but she never returned to his home mansion. So when they get married, of course, she immediately returns to his home mansion due to circumstances, and the story goes from there. So this is shelved as horror, but it's definitely not a horror. It's more of a gothic romance with horror elements and suspenseful elements. It's definitely in homage to Rebecca and other gothic romances like that. I liked this one. I thought it was fun. It's also definitely much more of a fantasy bent than I was hoping. Like, I thought it was going to be more actual horror, and then when it started to be romantic suspense, gothic romance, I was like, okay, that's fine. But then there's a lot more fantastical elements that happen, so it turned out to be a lot more of like a gothic fantasy romance suspense with horror elements. So I did like some of the horror elements. There were definitely some creepy things, some gross things, because Dr. Lawrence is a doctor. There's a lot of like medical horror and gross things like that. So I like that. And I do like Caitlin Starling's writing. It's a little bit flowery, but without being like purple prose. And I like her characters, especially the two lead characters that I've read are very self-sufficient. They're very matter-of-fact. They know what they want and they go after it. But they are often surprised by their own feelings and their own emotions, and so it makes for interesting conflict within the characters. I did enjoy this one. I didn't think it was like amazing, and I definitely don't think it will stick with me forever, but I will continue to read Caitlin Starling's work. I know she had a book come out in 2023 that I'm really interested in, and her like most well-known title is The Luminous Dead, which I think is like an underwater horror, so I would definitely be interested in reading that. I was disappointed that Jane Lawrence did not really have queer themes. I mean, like maybe very obscure queer themes, but like not really. I mean, you could call Jane asexual in that she is not interested in sex or romance until she has a bond with someone, so she does need that connection and that bond to feel romance and to feel sexual attraction, but like that's a stretch, you know, it's not mentioned in the book and it's not like explicitly stated. So I would say no major queer themes, no queer themes in this of note, which I was disappointed in. I was also a little disappointed that it wasn't like true horror, just because there were some great horrific elements in Yellow Jessamine that I really enjoyed, and I was reading this for Horror Mayhem, so you know, it didn't really work out. The next book that I read in May was Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead by Emily Austen. Side note, so I did read Jane Lawrence on audio, and I really did enjoy the audio narration. I read this book on audio as well. I got this last year at the Ocean Grove library sale, which is coming up in July. I'm so excited for it. But this one, everybody loved. The internet went wild for. BookTube went wild for. And I was excited to get it and pick it up, but I had a feeling I was not going to like this book. I am interested in Emily Austen's other work, so I did want to read it, and I did try reading it physically. Like, I started the first couple pages and I really wasn't into it, so I'm glad that I was able to get into the audiobook, because I ended up really, really liking Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead. Great title. This book follows Gilda, who is like a 30-something, like super lost character. She suffers from depression, she suffers from severe anxiety, she's been in the hospital every, few days for the last few months because she thinks she's having a heart attack, she's having panic attacks, she is freaking out about life. Her brother is struggling, and so every time she gets home, she's picking him up, she's helping him when he's drunk, she's trying to talk to her parents about figuring out what's going on with him. Her parents are not nice people. Her mother's very much in denial about all the family's problems. Her father, who's had mental issues in the past, denies that mental issues exist. And Gilda is also dealing with being queer and feeling very isolated from her family, but also isolating herself because of her anxieties. When Gilda sees an advertisement for a therapy group, she goes to investigate. It turns out that this therapy group is at a church, and when she goes to the church, she gets mistaken for a person who's there to interview for the receptionist job, and because Gilda's mental state often means she takes the path of least resistance, she says yes, that's why she's there, and she ends up getting a job at this Catholic church. Gilda is an atheist, and so now she's hiding her identity, she's hiding her queerness, she's hiding her non-religious beliefs, she's kind of freaking out about all this, and she's learning about all the people in the church. At the same time as all this is going on, Gilda is like tentatively trying to keep her relationship with a girl that she's been dating. Realizing that she is super isolated, Gilda did go on dating services and she's met this girl that she really likes. So she's trying to also keep up this relationship with this potential girlfriend. So this book is a lot about Gilda's like spiraling thought patterns and about the way she's feeling and the feeling of anxiety and having anxiety, the feeling of depression and having depression, that cyclical nature of not being able to get out of your own thoughts, absolute like doom thought spiral that you might get into when you suffer from depression or OCD or panic attacks or anxiety disorders. And it very much reads that way. It's very matter of fact. At one point, Gilda gets into a car accident and it's like her thought process. We're almost all in her head for this book. So it's her thought process of like what she's going to do and what's the path of least resistance and what's the easiest way to like get out of this situation and why she doesn't want to be in the hospital because the hospital people all know her. And it's just like builds on this like ramping up of anxiety until something happens, and then it kind of settles down and you see her not being able to cope with being at home. You see her not being able to do her own dishes, not being able to fix things in the house, simple things like a door like a cabinet hinge or something like that. And then the action will start to happen again and that anxiety will ramp up. So I think in that way, it's a very harrowing book. It's funny and it's light in tone, but the way that it's written really ramps you up to that anxiety level. And I definitely felt myself having anxiety while reading this at some points. But then again, it's light, it's fast, it's short. So you get past those parts pretty quickly. So I think it's pretty well
conceived and well done for those reasons. Like, it's really evoking an emotion in you, which the book wants you to have. All the relationships are interesting. The side people are interesting. There's a little tiny bit of like a mystery going on. Well, there's a couple little tiny mysteries going on, but more like day-to-day life mysteries that Gilda is unfolding. So at the end of this book, I'm not going to say why. Well, should I say why? Okay, so if you have not read this book, skip ahead like 2 minutes and, or till you see the next book, because this is very, very, very mild spoilers. But at the end of this book, I cried, and I cried because it ended happily. Like, it ended on not a completely positive note, but on a positive note. And I'm just not used to reading queer books with happy endings. I still get emotional and I still feel overcome when queer characters have happy endings. So I was super surprised and like burst into tears at the end of this book, but I really did enjoy it. If you're interested in a queer book, if you're interested in those ideas, I would definitely suggest picking this one up. It is worth the hype. The last book that I read in May was Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore by Robin Sloan. This is the second Robin Sloan I've read this year. The first one I read was Sourdough, which was published after this one. This book follows Clay, who moved to San Francisco having a like tech social media management kind of job where he was working for a bagel shop and running their website and doing their advertising campaigns. And Clay's pretty good at like picking things up as he goes along. He's pretty good about seeing holes that need to be filled and then learning how to do the work to fill those holes. But that job and the bubble that Clay was living in quickly bursts, and he finds himself out of a job, running out of money, and going for walks every day to read the help wanted ads in the paper when he sees a help wanted ad at Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore. He goes in, and through what Clay later thinks of as kind of a mystical sort of connection, he ends up getting the job. So this book follows Clay as he discovers the secrets and different aspects of the 24-Hour Bookstore. It follows him as he is figuring out what the deal is with this bookstore, but also kind of figuring out his place and what he wants out of life. We meet a large group of characters that Clay knows and that help him in various ways. Through the bookstore, he meets a girl that he starts dating, and we see all the connections in Clay's life and how this mysterious bookstore just kind of ramp up those connections, and how the joining of community is wonderful, and how Clay tackles different problems in his life. So it definitely is like a magical realism. I kind of hate that term. It's much more like fantasy sci-fi, I would say. I mean, very, very, very soft sci-fi. Like, there is science in the fiction, and there is fictional science in this book, which was very much the same with the other book that I read by Sloan. And Sourdough and Mr. Penumbra are definitely in the same universe. Like, you can tell just from the writing and the setting. And there may have actually been characters, very, very minor characters, that crossed over like in name only, but they were so minor that it was hard for me to catch. I did recently find out that there is like a little short story that bridges Sourdough and Mr. Penumbra, so it is confirmed that it's the same universe, but it's also very obvious from reading it that it's the same universe. And this is the kind of book that I really, really like. It has that touch of fantasy and magic, but at its heart, it's a story about found family and sticking to your ideals and overcoming obstacles and being resourceful. And, it's mostly like a happy, cheery book. There are some hardships that go on or some sad elements, but it's mostly following the adventures that Clay gets up to and meeting all his friends. And I love that both Sourdough and this book had a wide range of characters that were all very interesting and all connected in some way, but you didn't have to know like every single backstory of every single person. Like, each character was interesting and you wanted to know more about them, but you didn't need it for the book, and the book only touched on them. So you get this like snippet of these new characters that you want to know about and you hope that there's more of. And luckily for some of these books, it seems like there are, or there will be more of this. I heard mixed things about this when I picked it up. I'm surprised because I really, really like this writing. I really, really like this idea. I really, really like this universe, and it's just fun. It's just like fun and easy. a little twee at the end, a little cloying, a little too cute maybe, so I could see why people wouldn't like that. But overall, I really enjoyed this one. So those were the books that I read in May. A lot of different books, a lot of different genres, a lot of different things going on. I read for Horror Mayhem. I read for AAPI month. I read for my baseball vlog. I read a bunch of Asian or Asian American authors. I read a few books that were on my 24 and 24 list, so that's cool. I found a new favorite of the year. This is definitely going to make my favorites by the end of 2023. By the end of 2024. I read some hyped books. I read some translated works. So overall, a great month. Not heavy on the horror for Horror Mayhem. Not heavy on some of the other readathons that I wanted to join in but didn't get a chance, but I did read quite a bit and I read diversely, and that always makes me happy. So let me know if you've read any of the books that I mentioned here. Let me know what you thought of them. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!